what a bank run is. And so the banks just say, fuck this shit. They close the doors and you can't get your money out. And now they're saying you might not be able to get it out at all. But what I thought was interesting, because I looked this up, the catalyst for the bank run was that the European Union came out and said that they made a $12 billion deal to bail out the bankrupt government of Cyprus, but 10% of the bailout money had to come from the savings accounts of citizens. What the fuck? You can't just
Yeah.
do that.
Well, they're trying. They're not going to stop what they're trying to do, which is just exploit the people over and over and again. And it's kind of like a frog in boiling water. You got to figure out what is the degree to which the people start rioting,
Yeah. And then go 1 degree less.
and then yeah, tone it down a little bit.
That's
But
unbelievable.
the bank run on Cyprus, that used to happen. I mean, it has a potential happening anytime, especially with fractional reserve banking. I wrote a blog. You can see one of the oldest posts about this. But with fractional reserve banking, actually any bank is liable to be a victim of a bank run because they only ever have 10% of the holdings of what they are claiming to have.
Right.
And so if 20% of the people tried to pull out the money all at once, that would be twice as much as they had. It would be over with.
There
But
was
it's interesting, because everything's done with computers nowadays. So you think about like global strategy and what kind of large moneyed interests might be teaming up to devalue certain currencies or change the commodities prices.
yeah, I actually it's funny about you learn that about banking. I watched a documentary. It's like a really long ass thing called The Money Masters, and it's really low production, but there's a lot of good information in it. And basically, his theory, if I remember correctly, is that the Rothschilds made their entire banking dynasty just on being bold enough to say, "Yeah, you can borrow that money," when they had no money to be borrowed. And it's easy to visualize how it works today with computer screens. You just type it in. But it's, I guess they just wrote a check. Some guy comes to, a government, let's say a king comes to Mayor Rothschild and is like, man, we need $5 million. And he's like, all right, well, here's a check for 5 million. You can pay me back with interest at 10%, and we'll call it a day. And then they've got this check, and they're like, oh well, we've got the money, and then they go buy what they need to do, and then he's just charging them interest. And he didn't ever really have the money, and he did this in such a bold and aggressive fashion that he's now the banking. The Rothschild dynasty is all it is. All banking and central banking is based off that model of not really having what you're lending.
And it starts there, and it's from the top down. It's these. There's a difference between people who are poor debtors, meaning the poor who have no money and have to borrow credit in order to just eat and get by, and rich debtors who are millionaires. When it says like a millionaire bought this, retail chain, well, what that actually means is a millionaire negotiated with some bank some ridiculous loan amount, and the bank didn't have it either, and the bank's just loaning it from the Fed, and up it goes. And the Fed, they ultimately don't have it. So this money is just on promise, and that's what it goes on. As for rich debtors, there's just a promise to pay. Well, you're in a rich class, you're one of the boys, so you can have any loan amount you want, and we can always renegotiate terms. But for the poor debtors, they're screwed. That's
Yeah.
how the rich debtors get their interest money, is by taking it from all the poor people who are behind on payments.
Right. And then you give the poor people or the middle class people, people who are still in denial that they're poor, we'll call you the middle class. And then you give them this false illusion that if they just work hard, they're going to be at the top of that pyramid. And it's like our society idolizes that guy at the top. No one wants to really tear him down. Everyone just wants to get to that spot. And, you work your whole life away, and then you're 45, 50 years old, and you hit that midlife crisis. And that's really what a midlife crisis is the awakening that you're never going to get there, and you've been sold a lie, and you've bought a lie, and here you are. Fucked. So go buy a motorcycle and shut the fuck up.
Yeah, that moment of oh shit, the realization, the awakening, that is, yeah, I don't wish that upon anybody. That's why I tell people all the time, I don't advocate that everybody wakes up. It's not for everybody. It's not great. It's not great to research conspiracy theories and figure out what the government and the military is doing without your knowledge and your consent, but with your money. Like when I go to work and I slave away, I'm paying for the military to do things that I don't understand what they're doing.
Right.
But
I
it's
disagree with you. I think ignorance is bliss, but knowledge is power. And I think it's way more important. It is important to wake everybody up. I mean, some people, if you go into this whole esoteric idea of the old soul, and some people just aren't that far enough on their journey that they should be, really dealing with that. They're still trying to learn life 101 lessons, and this is more of an advanced evolution of life. That there's that whole thread out there, but I don't know. I think that you can't do any harm by exposing people to the truth. It may be a truth that they're not happy with or they don't like, but we have to change it. It won't be changed until it's faced.
I'm definitely all about exposing it and speaking out against injustice and voicing a concern and a want for something new to replace just what we just don't like and being honest about the fact that we don't like it. But as far as like, here's my analogy with waking other people up is that nobody can take a bath for you. And so
That's well said.
I can try to like hint, oh, some terrible shit's going on, you need to jump in the shower.
Yeah.
But it's really you who has to make the move. So yeah, I'm all about spreading the truth, but it's up to these people to actually wash themselves.
Well said. Somebody just sent me a video of a UFO hovering over the Vatican during the swearing in or the crowning or the sucking off or whatever they do to the new pope. And it's your typical blurry red light hovering, but it's cool nonetheless. But it's funny because your most recent blog post was about the ET phenomenon, and the most recent upload of the podcast was Kevin Annett talking about the conspiracies of the Pope and the Vatican. And then, of course, you would see a video of a UFO hovering over there. We saw one at the presidential Obama's inauguration, but I wonder why. Like, why? If you imagine them as beings in craft, first off, you can't hear shit from out there. You can't see shit from hovering up there. What are you fucking doing up there? It gives the impression or the sense that they're watching over us, but what are they really doing from a craft above some historical event? Because that seems to be the motif, is that they're present in these important moments in human history, watching over the event, like literally in the air. But I mean, what do you think they're doing there?
I mean, from them, like I'm trying to envision myself as an alien, and to me, it would be like I just show up to the Pope's announcement or whatever, because it's kind of like, you think this guy's special? Check this shit out.
Just to overshadow it? That could be the case. They could just be
like, whoa,
right.
for real.
They're looking at these huge gatherings of people, and they don't give a shit about the Pope or Obama. But they're just more trying to subtly nudge the consciousness into the acceptance of the weird, I guess.
Don't know.
Did you
maybe
see
they're Vatican craft?
That's true too. That could be possible. And on the subject of UFOs, our guest today, he's best known for revealing some secrets behind Roswell and the Battle of Los Angeles, mainly pertaining to the idea that they have to do with Japanese craft rather than alien craft. And if it's true, it's true. I mean, I'm interested in it because I want to get to the truth of it, of course. But I like the sexier story of aliens. But even if his stories are true and those two events aren't real, I don't think that the whole alien visitation phenomenon hinges on those two events. But assuming they're off the table, what do you think is the best evidence for modern visitation of aliens? What has swayed you?
I think personal testimony. I just think like the number of really validated cases. I think in one regard, when I saw the Disclosure Project that Dr. Stephen Greer put together, and saw all of these military officials and high-ranking positions, and these are established people who it's presented in a certain way where it seems like, oh, they were never able to say this, but now that they're retired, they're willing to go on record and say it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just such an amalgamation. So many people, so many similar types of accounts, both in contact experience, but that's its own different type of category than just a UFO experience.
Yeah. I remember listening to all that stuff, and I mean, if you people want to have some fun, get a couple of friends, get in a car, drive through the desert at 1 in the morning in pitch black darkness, and listen to the Disclosure Project and smoke some bowls, because that is a fun time. Looking up at the stars without any of the lights that block them out from our normal city life, it's a blast, and it definitely is better to me than any horror movie. It is creepy in some cases, and the fact that there's some reality to it makes it way scarier than anything else, in my opinion. But it looks like Douglas is about ready to Skype in, so let me once again petition the listeners to look into my conspiracy-themed t-shirts at conspiratees.net. There's a bookstore in San Diego called The Book Tree that is now carrying a few of the designs. I'm putting all I got into these shirts because I think it's important to bring a certain style and quality into the conspiracy world. It's also just good to get the ideas and the ideas that the art on the designs represent out into the open instead of just being in the back of everyone's mind. I mean, it's funny, man, because sometimes when I wear one, let's say the Riot Cop shirt, there are some people that think, like, they come up and they're like, dude, that's a great shirt. And when you put a bold, aggressive statement of art that represents something fringe, it's like a beacon for cool, like-minded people and a repellent from people you aren't going to want to get locked into a conversation with anyway. I've never heard anyone say, I hate the message on your shirt, but I want to engage you in a conversation now. And that's an excellent thing. And when cool people acknowledge your shirt, they become conversation pieces themselves, and that affects the hive mind and expands the message we all believe in. It's all from just a shirt. So check them out. They're not some flea market iron-on bullshit. But I'm going to let the ad do what it does, and Kyle and I will be right back with Douglas Dietrich.
We're here because we don't buy into the bullshit of mainstream culture. We're tired of the mundane, passionless careers we've been shuffled into as a result of this orchestrated debt-based system of rule, and the stranglehold on education and entertainment by cold, soulless corporations. People, yes, we are frustrated. Yes, we are tired. And we reject the brave root tranquilizers that are Monday Night Football and an ice-cold Budweiser. But we have to stop hiding. Stop hiding behind the headphones and the Cherry Popper 420 username. Let the world see that the resistance is strong and society is changing. There was a time to be anonymous, but that time has passed. And so the Higherside Chats would like to present Conspiratees as the dawning of this new paradigm in the uniform of the revolution. Because bold fashion should mean more than some celebrity meat dresser frat boy in a silly pink polo. Conspiratees redefines bold fashion as having the balls to reject socially uncomfortable and unpopular truths from your radiant chest all fucking day. Conspiratees.net. Let them know that you know. Bold designs for troubled times. Hard truths. Soft cock.
Folks, I think we've all seen enough evidence to know that there are hidden departments within government and military branches that operate independently and without oversight on programs and projects far outside of the mainstream from deep within their sphere of secrecy, and one can't help but think about the time and effort spent on ensuring complete privacy and systematic destruction of any evidence of these black ops programs. Think about a room deep in the bowels of a major military base where men in uniform routinely drop off mountains and mountains of top-secret, mind-blowing documents, while some guy spends his 9-to-5 shoveling these mountains of damning paperwork into a fiery incinerator never to be seen again. Now imagine if you could just sit down for an hour with a beer and a bowl and talk to that guy who had that job, and you'd be imagining the lives of Kyle and I right now. Douglas Dietrich had a long career running the incinerator for the Department of Defense Library at San Francisco's Presidio military base, and is here to share some of the information and experiences stemming from what might be the most exciting job imaginable. Douglas, thanks for being here. How are you, man?
Fine, and thank you so much for having me. And I'd like to share with our listenership the fact that because of that job, which was hardly 9 to 5, it was very definitely a night job. The incinerator was run at night. Due to
Fair
that,
point.
Yeah, and every career that I've had ever since, I am very much a creature of the night. Blood and oxygen hardly reaches my brain until 6 p.m., and I've had to caffeinate myself seriously in order to accommodate the more normal human schedule of Kyle and, of course, Mr. Carlwood. So I'm very glad to be here, and hopefully I've got enough stimulants inside of me where I'm coherent. So thank you for your patience.
Of course, man. I'm excited as hell to have you on the show today. I think we both know an hour isn't a whole lot of time for these topics, and I want to give you a chance to talk about some of the major themes you've developed since you've been speaking out, just to lay a base for the people. Then I want to branch out so you're not just answering the same old questions from interviews past. But let's start with the job. Can you describe it for people and then bring us up to some of the personal experiences you've had involving like Colonel Michael Aquino and Gary Handbright?
Yes, most certainly. The job itself I got with it was already unusual, and this is something that I'm saying that has never been said on air before, but it has been certainly circulated amongst many of my former interviewers. My manageress and Carrie Lynn Cassidy, who of course has conducted interviews with me in the past and is very famous in the alternative information media community as kind of a vetter for people who are coming out with unusual information or whistleblowers. Basically, both of them were under the impression that I was selected at a very young age to basically be part of some kind of program, and the evidence is certainly there. The unusual manner in which I entered employment with the Department of Defense is something that I myself have always wondered about. And it was through an act of incredible violence. It was through an assassination in San Francisco, a double assassination. What had happened was James Dean White of the San Francisco Supervisorial Board basically pushed his way past a secretary who was known to be flirting or somehow involved romantically with the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone. And he went into the office and shot Mayor Moscone to death, and he shot the gay supervisor, Harvey Milk. And Harvey Milk was, of course, known as the mayor of Castro Street. He was a gay rights advocate. He was the supervisor who had replaced James White. And when James White killed both of them, then Mayor Dianne Feinstein, at that time not a mayor, seceded to the mayoralty. So she seceded to the mayoralty under the most violent, unusual of circumstances, and without being voted in. And what happened was, and of course now she's a senator, impacting us with gun control legislation and whatever else agenda that she has. Now, the secretary was fired by her because she was known to be a lapsed secretary, and Dianne Feinstein apparently felt no need for a woman who had provided services to the former mayor, and she wound up being a receptionist at John O'Connell Vocational Institute, where Gary Willard Handbright was an instructor. And this woman, basically, because of the rep that she had, couldn't get a job in City Hall because of the politics. City Hall had very vicious politics, the weak go to the wall. No one else was going to employ within City Hall of San Francisco the mayor's former lab secretary. So she wound up at John O'Connell, and she was of Albanian descent, Shqiptari, and she spoke, of course, the Illyrian language and of Albanian, and the U.S. government had her employed doing propaganda broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain into the communist nation of the dictator Enver Hoxha in the Albanian language through Radio Free Europe. So she had all of these Department of Defense connections. And to add to the bizarre nature of this assassination, Dan White, the man who assassinated these two people, never spent a day in prison. He was put on trial and declared innocent in what became known as the infamous Twinkie defense. They said he had eaten too many Twinkies, was on a sugar jag, and couldn't control himself because he was overstimulated and killed the mayor and the gay rights advocate supervisor who had replaced him.
Wow.
So he went home, lived out his life for the next 7 years, and then killed himself when people started interviewing him. So that was an absolutely bizarre, almost like an MK Ultra programmed response right there. Now, this other lady of Albanian descent with all the DoD connections knew I was a military dependent simply by knowing me through the school. I would speak to her quite often. I was never a shy individual. I related very well with adults, far better than I ever did with my own peers my age. And she was saying, hey, at the Presidio military base, they got an opening at the Department of Defense library. Why don't you check in and apply for a job as a librarian's aide? And I was desperately poor. My whole family was impoverished. My father was a military veteran, and he was unfortunately an enlisted man who had served for 30 years. And his government, of course, had retired him with nothing, absolutely nothing. He had been wounded in several wars, but there was no disability because the Navy had no medical doctors on ships. What they had were pharmacist aides, and when they mustered people out, people who were literally what we would consider in the civilian world pharmaceutical technicians, or their assistants, and in this case it was literally a Filipino, what they would call a ward, who didn't speak much English at all. He spoke Tagalog, basically mustered my dad out with quote-unquote no injuries, so we had no disability. We had only half of what he earned in the Navy, so our entire family was scraping by with nothing. So I was desperate, and I asked for employment as a librarian's aide at the Department of Defense Library, at the main post library at El Presidio Rio de San Francisco. Now, it's important to emphasize that this was a base that was considered, quote-unquote, an open base, but that had nothing to do with my library work. The reason I was only able to apply was because I was a military dependent. As the child of a military veteran of 30 years of service, I was enabled to basically attend certain military schools if I had so wanted. I never did, and not as a child. By that I mean military-sponsored schools like would be at Treasure Island Naval Base, which no longer exists, just as the Presidio Military Base no longer exists. It's now national park land. But what happened was at the Presidio Military Base, if you're a military dependent, like I was, you have open access to the base, any areas that are not restricted. As a military dependent with a military dependence ID, I could go to any open base in the United States that was military. Nothing like Area 51, but at other places like Fort Bragg, San Diego, etc., I could go into, so long as I didn't go into restricted areas. But I could use the post exchange, the commissary, as they call it, etc. So all of this was quite open to me to find employment as a librarian's aide shelving books. So that's how I got started, and then within a very short period of time, I was graduated to the incinerator because basically we had a bunch of people who were lazy, stupid, and incompetent who were government bureaucrats. Now, this is the worst of both worlds because the Department of Defense is 100,000 civilians that work for the U.S. government. They are technically part of the military. The military, all the branches of service, Coast Guard, Air Force, Army, all answer to the DOD. Then the DOD in turn answers to the executive commander-in-chief. So that's the way it works. So the military has a civilian command overlay, which is not in uniform and which does not obey any military regulations. Now, that is impossible to explain to most people who are not familiar with this. In other words, you have people at the Pentagon, many of them civilians, who are not in uniform, they're not saluting, they're not following military protocol, they're running the show, they're in charge of the records and documents, and this is where all of your information leaks, a great deal of them come from. I mean, this is not like when I have extremely naive people. There was a man in Australia who said, oh, Douglas obviously never worked in the military, and another person who said, oh, yeah, if you were in the Marine Corps, with a security level of a Lance Corporal, you'd never see all this information. Well, all of these people just aren't getting it. First off, I was not doing any of this in the military. This wasn't like Private Bradley Manning. And to put him into perspective, since I was in the Marine Corps, Bradley Manning was gay. And he's very open about that. That was part of the motivation he had for releasing what he did.
Really?
Bradley Manning was, like many people in the military, gay but unable to speak about it. He was promised by his commanding officers that President Obama, or executive office holder Obama, was, since he's not legally president, since he's probably not a citizen, but at any rate, the commander-in-chief, they said, was going to do away with don't ask, don't tell. And in the meantime, Bradley Manning in Afghanistan was essentially kind of like what we would call a prison bitch. He was basically being swapped from various officers who were pillow talking to him about various secrets. And when Don't Ask, Don't Tell never manifested, he became extremely angry, and somehow they handed him this whole slew of records. Now, keep in mind, private. He's a private. Suddenly winds up with all kinds of State Department records, an enormous amount of records. Okay, this is a totally sui generis situation, extremely rarefied, extremely exceptional. Somebody was hemorrhaging a leak on purpose. This was entirely purposeful. And they chose an angry private because they could scapegoat him and then stick him in prison. And he went for it. He released it to WikiLeaks. And, of course, we see the price he paid. We see what price Assange paid in how he was later set up. Okay, these are all people in this kind of exploited mode that is entirely different from the perfect storm of information release that I manifest. And what I manifest is someone who was in the DOD at the Presidio military base, which was probably the most important military base in the United States and the world in a very real sense, and I'll tell you why. The Presidio military base is 200 years old. It was established by the conquistadors. They enslaved the local American Indian tribe, the Ohlone tribe, to dig gold. As we know, San Francisco was seething with gold veins. That's why there was a 49ers gold rush. That's how San Francisco was established in the European-American sense. The conquistadors who were there before the Anglo-Americans basically were digging for gold first, established an enormous interconnected chain of underground gold mining tunnels underneath the Presidio military base, which is enormous. To put this into perspective for people, the San Francisco Peninsula, the city of San Francisco, is extremely small. It is one of the few cities in the United States which is both a city and a county. 1,500 acres of that was the Presidio military base for over a century, for centuries.
Wow.
And the oldest building in San Francisco is the Presidio Officer Building. It's over 200 years old. It's as old as any building on the East Coast. So this became the Western Defense Command Center, which means that it was the command center for not only the 17 Western states, but also the occupied kingdom of Hawaii before and during the Second World War. Hawaii was not a state until well after the Second World War. It's important to remember that. The United Nations was established there. The United Nations was established on site, El Presidio Real de San Francisco, on the 1st of January 1942, 3 weeks and 3 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was established as an organization of war per Title 42 of the United Nations Charter. In lieu of a constitution, they have a charter, and it was meant to orchestrate the military activities of resistance armies all over the world, stretching in an arc from Denmark in Nazi-occupied Europe to the Filipino resistance in Japanese-occupied archipelagos in Southeast and Southwest Asia. So the entire point that I'm making about the Presidio was that it was the Pentagon of the United Nations.
Right.
Before the United Nations itself was established as a peace organization, which did not occur until cessation of proactive prosecution of hostilities in 1945 in New York. But all of the military records of the United Nations were maintained at the Presidio throughout the Korean War, which was a United Nations action. It was a United Nations armed conflict. All of the bodies of American soldiers who died in the 1950 through the 1953 period of active armed prosecution of conflict in the Korean Peninsula, all of the bodies that are discovered decades later, they are sent home in coffins draped in United Nations flags. Their coffins are counted as United Nations fatalities. They're not counted as United States troops or United States fatalities. People don't understand that. So I was dealing with United Nations documents. Again, this was a point of information vulnerability. The United Nations, if you think the DOD is bad, with a bunch of civilians who are basically watching over each other, the United Nations is so corrupt, it borders on insanity. And as an example for this, as I spoke about last night, you have the United Nations, which is coordinating multinational units in peacekeeping actions. If you ever see the movie Black Hawk Down, all of those American soldiers had waiting right outside of that town in Somalia, right outside of Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, which of course has no capital because it's in a state of anarchy. But in Mogadishu, the American troops were literally breaking through walls, mud huts. They were just literally blowing their ways and through walls, wall after wall, to get out of Mogadishu and escape these hordes of people who were trying to kill them. All the while, there was a United Nations armored unit which was waiting right outside, full of Pakistani troops who refused to fire on the Somalis because they were fellow Muslims. So if you ever see that film, it's quite accurate when it portrays those troops leaving Mogadishu, and they're all holding each other up, they're supporting each other, and they're ambling and shambling towards this armored unit of Pakistanis who are just standing there staring and looking at them, and who are not providing them, even lifting a finger to help them, because they were Christian. See, this is how the United Nations operates. You've got a multinational units that are not cooperating with each other. The security is even worse. So all the information I was dealing with, considering United Nations military operations, and World War II, needs to be emphasized, was a United Nations conflict. All the troops on the front lines were handed little information pamphlets that were distributed or issued that would always describe this Second World War, this is the United Nations action, this is the United Nations action. Nobody in history remembers that today. Most academicians are propagandists. And most academicians will try and say World War II was Axis versus Allied. They'll keep using the term Allied, Allied this, Allied that. Well, the whole purpose of the United Nations was to conduct war against the Axis. It wasn't an Allied front in any way, shape, or form. It was the United Nations front. So all of these documents are there, and we've got all of these very corrupt people. If I were in the military, then yes, security clearances at different levels of rank would have impeded my seeing anything. And if I were in the military, yes, theoretically, if they're not smoking and joking, if they're not doping, if the officer shows up, you're supposed to have two men destroying documents who look at each other while an officer looks on to make sure that none of these men are reading the documents. Okay, well, that's a fantasy anyway, because none of that works the way it's supposed to. But the way it worked with me was all of the staff operators, who of course had 9-to-5 jobs, worked in the daytime, they hadn't touched the documents for 10 years that needed to be destroyed because of the basically what is known as a kind of revocation of security, that you have basically a clearance for destruction that comes with documentation that goes in increments, usually of 5 years. This one will say, one set of documents will say, do not destroy, do not open or destroy for 50 years. Another one will say, do not open or destroy for 25 years. Well,
wow.
When these things come up, then it's time to destroy them. Then they put them into an incinerator. Now, these are enormous locker boxes. They're about the size of a child's coffin. They go back to the Spanish-American War, so they did at the Presidio military base. And it's important to remember the Presidio military base was from where all of America's wars in Asia and the Pacific coast of Latin America were launched. All of the men who went off to the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, went off to Korea, went off to Vietnam, went off to the Pacific Theater of War in World War II, went off to fight the basically guano wars against Chile and Peru. All of these men disembarked from the Presidio military base. So we have this enormous backlog of information, and nobody had touched it for 10 years because the danger of the incinerator. It was a converted crematoria, and one of these drunken pukes, and this is how they would show up, too. They would be drunken, they would be drug-addled. If you ever work for the U.S. government, first thing you find out is you can never be fired, no matter what you do. And as I've explained before, you can literally not show up for work for months, and then clock in and just come back to work like nothing happened, and you'll still be employed. I'm serious.
Man,
I'm totally serious.
I want a job like that.
Well, that's the U.S. government. You want to know why you're going broke? That is what the U.S. government is doing to break you.
Good point.
Basically, these people have it all. They have medical insurance. They're medically insured. They have basically all of these benefits, retirement benefits. They have this governmental version of 401k. They're unionized. People don't understand that. Government work is a unionized, you have a government union. And all of these people don't do anything. And what happens is, I mean, literally, don't do anything. And they never retire. If you work for the government, you know what the daily conversation is. The daily conversation every day is, so what are you going to do when you retire? When do you want to retire? Because this was in the days before they started organizing people out of existence and saying, well, we have to get you to retire because we just can't afford you on anymore. But in the retirement, they're getting paid just as much as when they're working. So the whole point is they're just trying to get them off of the dole because they're trying to streamline the government. There's various things that they do that they're trying to budget cut with. This is why Schwarzenegger was just telling a lot of state government workers not to show up for work, only show up for work several times a week, so then they cut the hours. But at any rate, once they show up at work, they literally unplug the phones. They start literally masturbating to online pornography. I mean, I've seen this all my life. And there's no cameras. This is what everyone is saying. Now, we get back to Gary Willard Hambright. Gary Willard Hambright was personally responsible for infecting almost 1,000 children in the child daycare center at the Presidio military base with AIDS.
Oh, my God.
Where were the cameras? Yeah, where were the cameras in the child daycare center? There's no cameras in the child daycare center. And if there's no cameras in a daycare center, there sure as hell is no cameras in a records facility. There's no cameras anywhere.
Right.
Any cameras within a government building are pointing out towards you. They're not pointing in towards the government workers because they don't want you to see them spending all day literally masturbating to online porn, literally screwing each other physically sometimes, or otherwise doing nothing. We had what we called the Carnegie ladies was the name for them. These were the female librarians who were just incredibly elderly. And they had Parkinson's disease, many of them. Their hands would shake so violently they couldn't do any keyboarding. And we didn't have computers, by the way, in those days. They brought in computers as an experiment, and then they took them away. So all the while, until Presidio Military Base closed in 1995, the library closed in 1992, there was only a brief period of time we had computers in the library. So they were supposed to type. They were supposed to be the secretaries. They couldn't type because of their Parkinson's disease. So as a result, they didn't do anything. And they just sat there every day. This is what I'm talking about. And other guys would show up to work pig-faced drunk. We had one dude, and he would just lie down on the couch and sleep all day. See, as a librarian's aide, I got all scut work, and I was doing everything nobody else was doing. One of them was documents destruction. One of these guys had showed up so drunk to work, so saturated in alcohol, he bodily fell into the incinerator 10 years before I showed up and burned alive.
Wow.
And as a result, no one went near the incinerator for 10 years. So we had a backup of 10 years of documentation inside of locker boxes with metal edges so that they wouldn't break open if they fell off of a train in motion. This is how old some of these boxes were. They were meant for train transport. Then my job was to open them, collate the documents, make sure they were the correct ones slated for destruction, then throw them in the incinerator. That is how I exposed all of them. Now, no one was overseeing me because the incinerator had to be run at night. And because the incinerator was run at night, the reason for that, by the way, was because it made the entire library just sweltering hot. It made the library unbearably hot. And that would have been, of course, not conducive to the clientele who were using the library in the daytime, especially when the sun was out. So nobody was using the incinerator at the daytime. So my job was a night job. I was working alone, incinerating the documents. Now, my high school teacher at John O'Connell Vocational Institute, which no longer exists in the form that it existed in, the John O'Connell Vocational Institute was not a normal high school. It was known as San Quentin Prep. It was a shop school. It was meant to teach you a vocation. My vocation that I was learning was commercial art and illustration. Now, I went to high school or vocational school early because I took basically I took a GED to get out of high school early because of all of the conditions which I've just described, the gang activities, the fact it was San Quentin Prep, every shop was like a prison shop. But aside from that, I got in there early because I was part of the generation where they did away with junior high school. A lot of people don't know this, but we used to have a junior high school. What we have now is a middle school system. They did away with junior high school. They started a middle school system in an educational revamping experiment, and so we lost a grade. So we all went to high school one grade early in that era of the 1980s. So what happened was I was going to high school at an age when most people would still be in quote-unquote junior high. So here I am about 16 years old and in a vocational institute. I'm in San Francisco, which is the pornography capital of the world. So I was learning commercial illustration. So what I started doing was pornographic illustration for publishing in adult periodicals.
Whoa.
Now, I'm underage, but I'm doing adult pornographic illustration. My illustration instructor is Gary Willard Hambright. He was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. It's important to emphasize. He was homeless, so he lived in a church. Now, he couldn't keep his child pornography at the church, so he kept it on site the school.
First world problems.
Yes, he kept it on site the school in the storage facility of the commercial art lab. And what he would tell the people in the commercial art studio, he would tell everybody it was art references. So all the pictures of naked children, all the pictures of copulation, he'd say, oh, this is art references. See, because everybody there was learning how to do tattoo art. See, this was like San Quentin prep. So I was doing the pornography. And the point was that he got away with this for years because all the instructors knew about it, and the majority of male instructors would go there to peruse his child pornography for their own self-gratification. This is why John O'Connell Vocational Institute was ultimately demolished, was because of this scandal. And ultimately, they set up a new John O'Connell at the other end of the San Francisco Peninsula. Has nothing to do with the old John O'Connell. But at any rate, none of the staff is there. It's all different. But at any rate, the point is, so this is going on at John O'Connell. He also runs the Child Daycare Center. So when he was running the Child Daycare Center, we also had the issue of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. And one of my responsibilities as a scut jobber, as the person who was assigned to do everything as a gopher, basically they said, we're going to assign you under orders to do liaison work for Colonel Michael Aquino because he has desperate need of the services of the facility of the library at all hours. Now, Colonel Michael Aquino, to put this into perspective for people, he was a psychological warfare expert. He graduated from Fort Bragg in 1968 and from the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center. And he went to Vietnam in 1969. He was brought back to the United States to operate in psychological operations against the American public when Roswell incident broke out. Now, need to put this into perspective as briefly as possible. I certainly don't want to tangentialize into this unless, my interviewers want to go in that direction, but we can do a whole separate program about that in the future.
True.
Basically what happened was Roswell was 1947. It was an Army incident. There was no such thing as the Air Force in 1947. There was naval aviation in the United States Army Air Corps. The Air Force did not exist. So when Roswell took place, it was an Army responsibility. And then what happened was nobody heard about it after the incident until 1969. In 1969, men walked on the moon, and then Sergeant Melvin Brown, who had been on site at the Roswell incident, started to talk to his family. I dealt with enemy aliens at the Roswell incident. And they said, what are you talking about? He started talking about it and explaining to him his perspective on it. He was told not to look under the tarp, but he did. He saw the bodies. That's when the U.S. Army called Aquino back from the front and said, Colonel Aquino, you're a psychological warfare expert. You've proven to us in Vietnam the cost-effectiveness of the occult. What are you going to do about this? And that's when Colonel Aquino started responding with a psychological warfare campaign against the American public concerning disinformation concerning the Roswell incident. So that's when you started hearing about it. That's when Stanton Friedman started to talk. That's when all of these people became involved. And keep in mind, of course, Stanton Friedman was a DOD contractee. He worked with the Department of Defense for years on quote-unquote nuclear flight. And we talk about the records of nuclear flight. I dealt with them all. You're talking about these secret programs that produce absolutely nothing and go nowhere, that suck up enormous amounts of money. What Stanton Friedman did was perfectly involved with that.
Nice.
What he did with his so-called nuclear flight was Stanton Friedman basically was part of a program of the Convair NBH 36 Crusader program. What they did was they took a B-36 that had crashed in a storm. They reassembled it, and they put in a leaky nuclear reactor, and they put in a 10,000-pound lead bulkhead to shield the pilots from that radiation. Now, because that radiation would sterilize what got through any pilot that was piloting it, any navigator and any of the crew, all of the crew had to be well over 60 years old. So they had these senior pilots flying this leaky nuclear reactor. By the way, it's a prop-driven plane. It's a prop-driven plane. That nuclear reactor was not powering the plane. The whole point was just to get a nuclear reactor airborne so that they could claim they had nuclear flight. Now, all of it was a scam. It was being powered by oil, and they knew someday it was going to crash and create a massive radiological incident, so they had it basically followed at all times by various boxcar planes, what they used to call Douglas boxcars, that were carrying Marine Corps paratroopers. The Marine Corps used to have paratroopers, and their whole job was to surround the plane with a wall of human flesh and basically irradiate themselves whenever it crashed. Now,
Wow.
there were several times, it had a red line direct to the White House. There were several times that red line was used when there was smoke or fires that started in the back with that nuclear reactor that they had airborne. And what did they do with this? They flew all over the United States, and they irradiated the population of the United States. As a matter of fact, when they were flying low enough, they would microwave chickens in their coups. I'm not kidding. And they had a nickname for the program, SLAM, slow, low, and messy. They irradiated so much of the continental United States that Stanton Friedman moved to Canada. He lives in Canada, and he's got Canadian citizens. He won't even live here
Yeah,
because of all the radiation that was leaked.
Stanton
by
Friedman's
that.
great. We have had him on the show talking about the same stuff. It's good that you can corroborate some of these claims that he makes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so he was a government employee then. He's a government employee now. He was part of the Aquino program, talking about Roswell. That's the whole point of what I'm bringing up. That in a perspective that needs to be seen. But at any rate, so Colonel Aquino, the reason that he needed the library was Colonel Aquino had, of course, high-level security clearances. Colonel Aquino ultimately became a commanding officer at the colonel level, a commanding officer of psychological warfare forces. He was on second mint in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so he had an international security clearance. That's important to emphasize. He was also a member of the World Affairs Council, again, an international security clearance. So this is far upgraded from a national security clearance. And what happened was he took advantage of this to use the OCLC, the Online Cataloging and Library Cooperation Program. Now, as I've said, we didn't have computers other than for a very short period of time, but other libraries did, especially academic libraries. And what would happen would be Colonel Michael Aquino would use his international security clearance to access grimoires, or grammars, occult tomes that were hundreds of years old. We're talking about prior to the invention of the printing press, hand-published, leather-bound. Ultimately, some were bound in human skin, some were written in human blood. These are very old occult tomes that were said to have extreme power. They were so fragile that they were kept in refrigerated safes. And not even academic professors or archaeologists were allowed to look at them if possible, because what they were intending to do was ultimately to try and photograph each page and then basically put them on some kind of microfiche, which was the dead-end technology of the day, so that people could access the contents indirectly, because opening the books themselves would do irreparable damage to the books. Just opening a page, the page would probably disintegrate.
Really?
The vast majority of them. Yes, we're talking about books that are pre-Gutenberg, pre-printing press. And so these books were basically something that Colonel Aquino could get a hold of because he claimed it was a matter of national and international security. So because he claimed that, all of these academies in the British Commonwealth of Nations or the United States were forced to surrender these books to him, at least transitionally on loan. They were delivered like fine china or porcelain by a courier, which would bring them to the library, and because, per force, they could not leave the library, he conducted his occult rituals on site within the library itself. So when I'm destroying all of these documents, putting them in the incinerator, That was great for him because he felt it made the library basically have the ambient temperature and the ambiance of hell itself. So because it was so
Whoa.
tropically hot in the library, he and his cultists would basically hold their occult rituals in the library at night while I'm burning books in the incinerator.
Wow.
So he had various covens. I never once saw a member of his occult community that was beneath the rank of major. So the army was seething with Satanism, and he was ultimately, of course, recognized, actually at a very early stage, at the time that he was in Vietnam and proved the occult was cost-effective. I've spoken of this before, but I'll review it briefly. The army was experimenting with sound warfare, or sonic warfare against the enemy. They were trying to disorient the Viet Cong, or North Vietnamese army units, with sound disorientation. They were using helicopters with very large stereo speakers to broadcast demonic screams that would terrify the enemy or confuse them.
Holy shit.
And these helicopters were shot down quite frequently. The helicopters, it was a rule of thumb amongst the Viet Cong, quite literally, that if you held your thumb up in the air and a helicopter was bigger than your thumb, you could hit it with a rocket-propelled grenade. Now, keep in mind, your average Vietnamese individual is only about 5 foot tall, so their thumb is a lot smaller than an American thumb. And when they're holding their thumb up in the air and the helicopter's bigger, that means the helicopter's very close indeed, and they could usually take it out with an RPG. So that's what they did. The helicopters blaring these demonic screams, they would just take them out, and the U.S. Army would lose the crew, the helicopter, and probably worst of all to the U.S. Army, expensive stereo equipment. So what happens was they came up to Colonel Aquino and said, well, we understand that you're a black magician. And to put this into perspective, Colonel Michael Aquino had converted to Satanism before he entered the Army. He had entered the First Church of Satan under Magus Anton Zandor LaVey in around 1967 and converted to Satanism, so he was a full-blown Satanist when he entered the U.S. military. And by the time that he graduated from Fort Bragg, he had already conducted a number of rituals in Fort Bragg itself with fellow officers participating and converted many other officers to Satanism. Now, all this is vettable. This is what has been openly stated by himself.
Right.
And many officers have cross-verified that.
You just have to look at the guy, really. If anybody's seen him, he looks like a guy who's still into ICP. He looks like a Marilyn Manson fan that never grew up. He looks very goth. You know, he doesn't look like a colonel, as you might think, if you look up some pictures of him.
Well, he would go around in uniform with a full pancake makeup, full-face pancake makeup, his eyebrows clipped so that he would look like, basically vampiroid. And he had the widow's peak, and he got away with it because of freedom of religion. The Constitution, the whole purpose of the military is to defend the constitutional right of many segments of the Constitution, or many amendments, one of them being freedom of religion.
Let me interject for just a second. I just wanted to have you go into did you ever see any sorcery or magic use? I mean, it seems a little silly when you look at a guy like that and you see the makeup and everything. It's interesting that he's into these occult aspects, but have you ever seen any real power come out of that?
Oh, absolutely.
What kind of effects does that have?
Well, to put it into perspective for you, in Vietnam itself, where he was initially put his cult technique to use, footage was taken to prove to his superiors the efficacy of his workings. And what had happened was, by the way, he comes from a very long tradition of this. Nobody like Colonel Michael Aquino would have been accepted for what he was had the U.S. Army and military not already been veering towards Satanism. And the person before him that had pioneered that was Jack Whiteside Parsons, which we'll go into later in a bit, but because he's integral to the thread of Satanism in the U.S. military. But because of that, Jack Whiteside Parsons already kind of pioneering the occult connection, the military was aware of occult warfare. And so what the military did with Aquino was they said, can you put your skills to use about this sonic warfare situation? And what he did was he went into a deep contemplative meditative state, and some said it was even a comatic state. and he channeled 7 or 8 entities that he claimed were going to write a book through automatic writing. And
Whoa.
he channeled Satan, Beelzebub, Azazel, Abaddon, Asmodeus, Astaroth, Belial, and Leviathan. And once he consulted with them through automatic writing in a trance that was filmed, he basically wrote out quatrains like Nostradamus, poetic prose statements. And what he did was he basically wrote the Diabolicon. And the Diabolicon was something that he used as a grimoire, which was directly channeled unto him by powers from beyond. And he was able to call forth demonic screams out of thin air. Now, all of this was filmed on the battlefront in Vietnam, where I was witness to footage of Vietnamese soldiers being literally knocked off their feet by a wall of sound.
Wow.
And it was coming out of nowhere. The North Vietnamese command took his Diabolicon so seriously that they made it the objective of enemy attack. It was a military objective. So the 2 handwritten copies that I had to take care of at the Presidio Military Base Library, I was responsible for their care provision, so to speak, making sure they were in refrigerated safes. The 2 copies were both bullet-ridden and fire damaged. So that is how seriously it was taken by the communists, who are atheists. And basically, by proving to the military that the occult was cost-effective, that he could do without a penny what they were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on with stereo equipment, crews, and helicopters, they made him the official satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army. And to vet what I'm saying, to prove what I'm saying, in retirement, when he was retired, they contracted him to write the chaplain's handbook. And the chaplain's handbook, I've taken the contents of it and I've posted it several times on my Facebook timeline. People can consult that by scrolling down my timeline, looking through the various months. I might post it up again. I post it up periodically. Eventually, I'll have to have a blog spot where a lot of this information is permanently accessible.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that they didn't consult a rabbi. They didn't consult a Catholic father. They didn't consult a deacon. They didn't consult a priest or a pastor. They consulted a Satanist to write the chaplain's handbook. This tells you where the Army is coming from. The reason they contracted him was because they wanted to make sure that every other faith in the military respected the satanic faith. So the orders in the chaplain's handbook are about the use of magic in warfare, the purpose of Satanism when they're doing their work. So I hope that puts it in some perspective for you.
Definitely.
People say, how can this happen? To put it into perspective for the listenership, the entire United States military is extremely small. Not at all what people think. Not like it was in Vietnam. Now, when Aquino was active in combat during the Vietnam War era, we had a 1 million-man army in country in Vietnam. And the U.S. military-industrial complex was enormous. The military-industrial complex has stayed enormous in terms of budget, but its personnel has shrunk tremendously with the cessation of the draft. So with the cessation of the draft, they only get volunteers, and almost no one volunteers. So when you put together the 100,000 bureaucrats of the Department of Defense with all the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, National Guard, and Reserves combined, you get about 2.5 million people, and that's going to shrink by almost 500,000 due to sequestration. And do you know what that is? That's less than 1% of the U.S. population. The U.S. population is the third largest in the world. The largest is, of course, India and China with over 1 billion people each. The third largest is the United States with 350 million people. Of that 350 million people, you've got less than 1% in the military. And yet, that less than 1% of the military and DOD combined has statistically, annually, gotten over half of the discretionary fiscal income of the U.S. budget on any given year. They statistically, on average, get 51%. So you've got less than 1% of the population that gets over 51% of all the money from our discretionary fiscal income that could otherwise go to education, Social Security, anything else. Now, that's the 1%. People ask, what's the 1%? Occupy says, get rid of the 1%. This is it. And these people who are getting it are essentially a cult. By that I mean you enter the military. You cannot leave, by the way. Once you're in the military, until your term of service runs up, it's not like you can say, oh, I quit. It's like that's what happened with Bradley Manning. Bradley Manning, that private in the Marine Corps who's being used as a prison bitch and kind of, blow in and screw in all of these officers who are pillow talking to him and ultimately gets exploited to hemorrhage a controlled leak. This individual is basically a victim of the fact that he couldn't quit. So the whole point about being in the military is that you're an isolated community and it's easy to subvert. Now, with such a minority community, it became incredibly subverted by Satanism at the officer level. To give you an example of this, to anyone who feels in any way, shape, or form skeptical about this, the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, you have Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Challans, Challans, and Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Challans was responsible for indoctrinating the so-called cadre of Jedi Knights, the American Army officers who led the U.S. Army forces in Desert Storm. Now, I participated in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm as a Marine, so my entire command structure was different. But in the U.S. Army, they were commanded by men who were trained at the SAMS, School of Advanced Military Studies in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Just before they entered Operation Desert Storm, they were known as the Jedi Knights, their graduating class, and what Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Challans was teaching them was the Bible is one of the most genocidal books ever written. The necessary illusion propagated currently is that the Islamic faith is somehow more dangerous and violent than the Christian faith. I would argue that all of the Abrahamic religions are equally dangerous because they are all based on faith, which is by definition a lack of reason. Now, this is what radicalized Osama bin Laden. When all of the American troops were stationed in the House of Saud, in country, what radicalized Osama bin Laden was not that Christian infidels or crusaders were suddenly in the House of Saud, whose dynasty was responsible for the oversight of the most sacred holy sites in the religion of Islam, Al-Makkah and Al-Medina. What he was radicalized by was the fact that the cadre of officers leading those troops were Satanists. That's what drove him into a frenzy. And none of this, of course, was released to the public, that the very nature of the U.S. military is generating the enemies which we face. So, again, to put this into perspective with what was going on with the officers' corps, the conversion of so many into Satanism, how did this happen in what is, until recently, a majority, quote-unquote, Christian country? And what happened was what was known as the Officers' Massacre. This was basically a resignation, a mass resignation, kind of a mutiny, which they could not stop because of what had happened with the molestation of children under a satanic agenda that wound up alienating all the Christian officers who then ultimately did not renew their service to the United States military. To give you an impression of this, we had at West Point probably the worst of the officers' massacre outside of the Presidio military base. And what had happened was, in terms of West Point, in July of 1984, again, I was working with the DOD at the time. I was painfully aware of all of this. A 3-year-old girl was brought into the emergency room at the West Point Hospital with a lacerated vagina. She told the doctor who examined her that a teacher at the West Point Daycare Center had hurt her. And in August of that year, another parent came forward. By the end of 1984, 50 children had been interviewed by investigators. And what was the child daycare center? The number of the building for the West Point Daycare Center was 666. And the children at West Point told stories that would become just totally familiar. It happened at the Presidio Daycare Center and at all manner of military bases. They'd been ritually abused, said they had excrement smeared on their bodies,
Oh my
had
God.
been forced to eat feces and drink urine. This was happening at every military base in the U.S. military. Now, keep in mind, at this period of time, when all of this was going down and my high school teacher was running the child daycare center to the ground, the United States Army was responsible for bases in the Philippines, Okinawa, West Germany, Panama. Now, altogether, on any given day, either domestically or in foreign nations, the United States Army daycare centers were caring for 100,000 children a day. And basically, the Army covered up all of the cases. There was a doctor named Walter Grote, Grote. His 2-year-old daughter was among the children allegedly abused. And to put this into perspective for you, when my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, was convicted, was indicted by a federal grand jury for all of these assaults before he died of AIDS, he was indicted for no less than 14 assaults against children. All of them were under 4 years of age.
Oh my God!
And
4?
had he not, yes,
Wow.
under 4. All of them were under 4 years of age. Had he not died of AIDS, he would have been indicted for hundreds more, I assure you. But he died of AIDS while he was on trial. That's why it's a certainty that many of the children at the daycare center were infected with AIDS.
Jeez.
And but basically, Grote, the doctor I just mentioned, he, as far as I know, is still in a private medical practice now in New Jersey. He was an Army captain, of course, and MD is always an officer. And he turned down a promotion to major in 1984 to protest the Army's handling of the daycare center at West Point. And but the problems had started before then. In August of 1983, nearly a year before that case broke, a 22-month-old baby had been murdered by the mother's boyfriend, an Army staff sergeant, and he got a court-martial hearing. He was given an 18-month suspended sentence and a dishonorable discharge. Basically a slap on the hand. He didn't spend a day in jail. So they take child abuse very lightly. And basically he got out scot-free, was kicked out of the Army to prevent any publicity. This happened to 15-month-old girls. One of the men who claimed that was Dr. Pat Jones, a former pediatrician at West Point. Again, someone now in private practice, in this case in Texas. And he had a daughter who basically was molested. Now, what makes all of this so tragic and so incredibly sad was that they called in investigators, and the investigation was basically based on dozens of children, all of these witnesses. 950 interviews were conducted by at least 60 FBI agents that I know of. And the investigation was unfortunately led by a former U.S. attorney and future mayor, Rudolph Giuliani. And Rudolph Giuliani claimed that all the children were all making it up, and that as far as he was concerned, it was all childhood fantasies.
Wow.
Douglas, could you explain for us, I mean, for people who may not be familiar with this topic, what the connection is between ritualistic child abuse and trauma-based mind control, and kind of like where did that even start?
Well, that's an interesting point. Let me give you an example. When you see the movie Black Hawk Down, which we've just spoken about, there is, of course, the hero of the film. His name is Danny Grimes. He's a U.S. Army Ranger sergeant, and of course we know Black Hawk Down was based on a true story, the Mogadishu massacre of U.S. Army Rangers. Now, the hero of that film, Danny Grimes, is played by this Scottish heartthrob, and they changed his name to Danny Grimes as a character in the film, because the real character that he's based off of, Ranger Master Sergeant John Stebbins, was a child molester. And Ranger Army John Stebbins was turned in by his wife for abducting kids, keeping them in his basement, feeding them out of dog food bowls, and chaining them to the wall and raping them every day. Now, he did all this after he was retired. Now, he's spending the rest of his life in a military brig, Fort Leavenworth, and one has to ask, well, what's he doing in a military brig? Because since he conducted all of these attacks, these assaults on children, these abductions, these molestations, after his retirement, he should be in any regular civilian jail with any other baby rape and SOB. But he's in a military brig. Well, what this tells you is that he was under military control at the time the crimes were committed. In other words, he was raping all of his children under orders. Okay? You don't wind up in a military brig. You can't wind up in a military brig unless you're under military control. End of story.
Yeah.
So in terms of why is he doing this under orders? And that's because he creates traumatized children. Now, this is all part of a program that is known as a super soldier program only in terms of popular vernacular. It is a horrible term. It misconstrues the reality of the situation because, of course, we think bigger and badder, and we think of them genetically creating
like Jason Bourne or something.
Yes, that's right. And the reality is, what they are doing is they take adoptees, orphans. These are taken out of foster families that are raping them, abusing them. They have no legitimate bloodline to complain to, nobody to represent them. They're often brought into mass orphanages where they're abused by staff intentionally. And you talk to many of them, they have memories of being consistently brought to areas where men in uniform are interrogating them, whipping them, electronically electrocuting them. Anyhow, they ultimately raise these children to bond with animals. They'll take them to bond with animals at animal shelters, have them adopt puppies and kittens, and after they feed and bond with these animals and puppies and kittens and raise them for a period of several months, they'll order them to kill them or torture them into killing them, threaten them with their own lives. They will die if they don't kill the animal.
Wow.
This creates a traumatic split in the mind that ultimately breaks the person into several multiple split personalities. Then they will ultimately have them pair up with children who they will kind of have as an adopted sister or brother, bond with them, and then one of them will be ordered to kill the other, whichever one is not performing better.
God.
And ultimately they become extremely split, very bifurcated. So you can create multiple personalities in an individual, and this person is a perfect assassin because the person has multiple personalities. None of them remembers what the others are doing. Indeed, the personalities are on different timelines. In other words, one personality will literally never develop, so it'll be infantile. There'll be another personality which is 16 or 17 years old. It's you have others that are prepubescent as opposed to adolescent. They have others that are more mature. Now, the whole point is all of these bifurcated personalities on different timelines are perfect for the assassin because if they're captured by an enemy intelligence unit or a domestic rival intelligence unit, the government is not a united house. It is a house divided. If they're captured by local constabulary or local police, no matter how much interrogation or torture they undergo, they cannot recall what they did because literally another personality did it. And unless you know the code words, the trigger phrases to bring that personality out, no one can bring the information out of them. Now, this is going to sound extremely strange, but an excellent analogy for this visually would be the Madonna video, Die Another Day, where she actually portrays a super soldier type assassin under interrogation. And in her mind, while they're torturing her, she has two separate personalities that are conflicting with each other until one kills the other. Now, the ending of it is fairly surrealistic and fairly mystical because Madonna is, of course, into the mystique of Kabbalism and kind of uses that to turn the video towards her own creative ends. So she uses her own vision to take it out of the realm of which I just spoke, which is a very practical, very hardcore psychological block that's created to prevent these assassins from talking under interrogation. But one of the things that manifests in the video is spontaneous bleeding. In her mind, while the two separate personalities are battling each other to prevent her opening up to her interrogators, as they're cutting each other, open cuts appear on her body physically. That is how intense the psychological effect of these personalities actually is on these genuine MK Ultra products. Okay, now why are they doing this? Why are they creating these twisted child assassins? How do you think less than 1% of the population gets over 51% of the discretionary income every year? It is because all of the politicians are in hock to the military because many of them are sleeping with these products of that program. These children are basically queer whores. The overwhelming majority of them are boys. That is the term that is used in the document.
I've never heard that term.
Yeah, that's the term that's used in the documents I was dealing with. They are girls. There are girls, but the overwhelming majority of them are boys. they are taken to politicians who become compromised. And these children, of course, sleeping with these politicians, get to know their estate, whatever New York skyrise apartment complex they're living in, whatever outdoors dude ranch that they're vacationing in, whatever kind of normal grounded estate with trimmed lawns that they are living in. These children get to know all the nooks and crannies, and if they have to, they can come back if they're trigger coded and kill that politician. And the whole point is, at that point, they're usually given the command to kill themselves. Now, nothing would ruin a politician more in terms of his family's ability to get into politics. Keep in mind, all politicians are dynastic. Any politician has a child who becomes a politician. Now, nothing would destroy their entire bloodline's ability to politically operate than them being found dead in a murder-suicide with a young gay lover. So that is what they hold over, basically, pretty much your entire administrative body in the United States. And what happens is, if they don't turn over all that money to the military every year, then what I just described will take place. Now, in the interim, many of these assassins are used all across the United States against whistleblowers, against various other people who they feel are a threat. They leave a trail of bodies all over North America, and they can't remember any of it.
Wow.
So that is, hopefully that puts that into some perspective.
Yeah. You briefly mentioned the Madonna video, and I'm really interested in the links there between Hollywood and the symbolic representation of these types of programs. It seems to happen in Britney Spears videos. It seems to happen in Lil Wayne videos. Do you know much about the connection there? Can you elaborate on that at all?
Well, Hollywood is very adjunct to the military. To put this into perspective for you and remind me, I will speak to about Lady Gaga concerning this. As a matter of fact, let me address that first,
Sure.
and then get back to movies like Independence Day and the Battle of Los Angeles, which is so important as part of this connection between the military and Hollywood. The Lady Gaga video, Bad Romance, when it first came out, I really didn't see it until maybe a year or two after she had released that song. And then when I was looking at it, was just when I was becoming acquainted with computer technology, believe it or not, on a practical level. And I found myself replaying that video again and again and again and again and again. And I couldn't understand why. I said, what is this that is locking me on the video? There was something to it that was just mesmerizing to me. Then I realized exactly what it was. It's that scene in that video, which is not in all of her renditions of Bad Romance. And she does not lip sync. Every song that she does, every song she delivers or performs is different from the last. Each one is slightly different. So there are times when she goes through certain motions on stage that she doesn't do other times when she's on stage. But the video captured it perfectly. And there's a moment where she's saying, I don't want to be friends. And she's clawing in the air, and she's repeating that multiple times, clawing and kicking, and realized that is exactly what I had witnessed with a ritual abuse victim at the Presidio military base. We had, believe it or not, a children's room in the library because, of course, we had a daycare center, and there were all these military families with children. So we had a children's room, and that was probably the only use, admittedly, we got out of the Carnegie ladies was to have them read stories to the kids. Fairy tales and whatnot. Now, at one point, there was one of these girls, and many strange incidents were ongoing, but one that really stood out was one of these young ladies who, again, had to be 4 or 5 years old. She was in the children's room, and she refused to leave. And they sent me in there as a librarian's aide, the Carnegie ladies who were too weak or frail to pick her up. They said, go in there and bodily remove her from there, so that we can have her come out of here and basically have her wait outside. I want you to wait outside with her so her parents can pick her up. We don't want her here in the library. There was something that was going on that frightened them to death. So I basically went in there, and I, of course, bodily picked her up, and all the while she was kicking and clawing and scratching at me. I don't want to be friends. I don't want to be friends. I don't want to be friends. And that, by the way, is a key child molester's term. Every time child molesters approach children, it's always, let's be friends. See, that's where that came from. And so when I saw Lady Gaga doing that just so perfectly, that brought that right back to my mind. Now, I had scars on my face, nail tears, just rips from her
Wow.
fingernails falling into my face for weeks, if not months after that, because of the intensity which she was trying to claw my eyes out. So this is the kind of the kind of phenomena that literally leaves scar tissue on my soul. So this is how those music videos can sometimes, through art, expose this. And one has to wonder as to whether or not many of these celebrities, such as Britney Spears, break down. One of the things that is common, for instance, amongst the different personalities is the different personalities created in the products of MK Ultra, various mind control programs, have different accents. You will have some personalities that are not only on different timelines, they're of different cultures. Now, all of them will be within a generic Western subculture because their trainers are Western. The different personalities will not speak Chinese. They will not speak ancient languages. When you get into that, then you're dealing with possession. Totally different phenomena. But the MK Ultra products will basically speak Southern accents. They'll speak with British accents. So each time someone flips into a different personality, they will suddenly start speaking in a British accent or a Southern accent, and you wonder, where the hell does this come from? You know, where's this coming out of?
Right.
That's their different personality kicking in, and what's called an alter. And so in the case of Britney Spears, you can clearly see her go into alter when she goes into a British accent. And her breakdowns mentally are no fault of her own. She needs compassion, not abuse. And so one really has to assume that it leaks over into Hollywood. Now, one asks, why?
Right.
Well, the reason why is because Hollywood and the military are both meat markets. All they're looking for is fresh, young, warm bodies.
Good point.
And the whole point about Hollywood is that it's subsidiary to the military as a propaganda arm. Now, when you take a look at Top Gun, when you take a look at Independence Day, when you take a look at Battle of Los Angeles, any of these multi-mega million-dollar budget films, actors are not flying those planes or helicopters in those films. What are flying those planes and helicopters and those jets? It's not CGI, by the way. It's real military pilots.
Yeah, it'd have to be.
And these men, all this firepower, literal firepower, is being provided for these films because they're sending a message the military wants to send. Now, if you ever take a look at Top Gun, or you take a look at Independence Day or Battle of Los Angeles, Independence Day and Battle of Los Angeles are even worse than Top Gun because they're like 3.5 hours. We're talking about films that are literally 3 to 4 hours long, and all they are extended recruiting ads.
Good point.
And the whole point is that they are supported in wartime. Now, according to Title 38 of the U.S. Code, we've been in an operational state of war, undeclared, since 1990, since Operation Desert Shield, Operation Desert Storm. So we're in a constant state of war, and we're in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan. We occupy 150 nations across the globe. There are 195 United Nations recognized nations on Earth. I happen to have been born in Taiwan, where the Republic of China reestablished itself. It is not recognized by the United Nations, even though the Republic of China was one of the founding member nations of the United Nations. It was expelled. And because of that, we're not recognized as if we don't exist, and yet there are other nations that are recognized, and there's 195 of them. Out of that 195, 150 of them are occupied by U.S. military forces, who, as I've said, constitute less than 1% of the population. So of that tiny increment of our population, it's spread all over the world in penny packets in a state of occupation and war, and you've got these troops in these BOJS, Foreign Legion-type forts under siege in fire bases in Afghanistan and Iraq, and these people basically are being constantly recycled, redeployed, used, and yet they're able to pull them out of action, pull them out of the front, and use them in films like Independence Day, where Marine Corps pilots are flying Marine Corps choppers. And you've got them flying in films like, that was Battle of Los Angeles. Independence Day was jets, and in Top Gun, etc. Now think about what I'm saying. You're in the middle of combat, and yet you're able to pull out key military air mobile personnel or airmen and use them for a propaganda film. I mean, this shows you how important this is to the military. So they're providing this firepower of personnel in time of war away from the front, and they're making these films because they need recruits, and they need to sucker them in with films like that. And it goes to show you how close the military and Hollywood operate. That's where the MK Ultra connection comes in. And I hope that puts it in some perspective.
Oh, definitely. I was going to ask, too, just based on all this corruption within the military, is what about the similar, like, parallel groups like subcontractors, like Blackwater? Are you familiar with, like, their involvement? It seems like since the Iraq War, that's been a much bigger – it's kind of like it's all just for money. It's just a big money grab.
Well, absolutely. This is the problem that was destined to occur. Is basically the fact is that the military is less and less capable of carrying out its task, less and less capable of carrying out operations. One of the major reasons for that is because of its deployment for non-military functions. Now, I actually have a book which was published by the Department of Defense. I have it at home, and people can probably find this online and buy a copy of it off the internet if they want it. But it's titled Military Operations Other Than War. Now, think about what I'm saying. What the devil is a military for other than war?
Right.
But this military operations other than war is where the military is being redeployed to be to be basically a Meals on Wheels distributor on treads. And they're sent all over the world to distribute food, to act in nation building, as they call it, etc. They're there to basically do everything that the Peace Corps is supposed to be doing. But since the Peace Corps is going to get slaughtered and massacred wherever it goes, they send in the men with guns. So this is the absurdity of the situation. So since the military is being turned into an armed Peace Corps, what do? Well, what they have to do is hire mercenaries. Well, where do they get the mercenaries from? Well, that's easy. They get them from the retired military. See, in the military, you learn nothing that will get you employment in civilian life. I don't care what the recruiters tell you about all this crap about learn high technology. Yeah, learn all this, you're going to get educated, all this crap. It's all
Right.
a load of crap. The point is, what are you going to do? Take a look at the Marine Corps. They're going to cut them down through sequestration by 20,000 men. There's 200,000 men in the Marine Corps. They're going to cut it down by 10%. Now, you get those Marines out there in our already depressed economy. What about these guys who have spent their last 5 to 10 years in the Marine Corps doing nothing but repairing tank treads? Okay, where the hell are they going to find employment? I mean, you can't even find employment in an auto mechanic shop after doing nothing but repairing tank treads anymore. It's not like anyone's going to bring in their lawnmower on tread.
Right.
It's a joke. Then you get these other guys. Oh, what did you do in the Air Force? Oh, well, I worked with radar. I was with NORAD, North American Air Defense. I was working with high-tech radar. What job are you going to find in the civilian field? Helicopter pilots. Look at helicopter pilots. There are like maybe 100 times, if not more than that, trained helicopter pilots than there are jobs for them in the civilian world.
Right.
Because you got military loaded with helicopter pilots. Now, unless you get a job with a air mobile television unit, or you get a job with a CHP or something, you are never going to find a job as a helicopter pilot. So the whole point is, what do these people do? They
Scenic
hire
tours.
them back as, what's that?
Scenic tours.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, well, they hire them all back through Blackwater and various other mercenary agencies so that the government can have plausible deniability. This way they can say, oh, it's a private mercenary company that committed the atrocity. Oh, it's a private mercenary company that did this. Oh, that's plausible deniability, so the government cannot be held accountable. And that's where Blackwater comes in. Now, at the height of the Blackwater deployments in Al-Iraq during the Bush Jr. administration, half of the boots on the ground were Blackwater. think about what I'm saying. 50% of the occupation troops of Iraq in country were Blackwater mercenaries. That's how massively the private contract companies have expanded. I'm painfully familiar with all of this. I was a mercenary. I did not work with Blackwater. And I worked with other private contracts, and I served in the mid-'90s. And the point is that I'm very familiar with mercenary work. By the way, it's illegal by international law. By all international law, it is illegal to be one. Mercenary armies are illegal by United Nations. What do we call it again? Regulations. It is another term for them, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
It just escapes my brain. But at any rate, it's done, and everybody acknowledges it. And since the United Nations is headquartered in the United States, they really can't complain about Blackwater, which of course went through several name changes because of the multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar lawsuits that were thrown against it in international court by victims of their atrocities. And they ultimately were able to change their name back to Blackwater, if I understand correctly. And so these are military veterans who know no other occupation than war. And it's important to remember that when you use the term mercenary, mercenary is not just a man with bandoliers and bullets and guns. Mercenary also refers to radar operating technicians that are working in private contract, also refers to private helicopter pilots in private contract. It refers to all of the military specialties, MOSs, except that they're under a private contract. And places will hire them, nations will hire them, where you have a whole army of technicians as well as troops on the ground that are mercenaries. So I hope that puts that into perspective for people as well. Mercenary armies are much more complicated than people realize. Blackwater is one of the first that is an army unto itself and manufactures its own weapons as well. So we have a monstrous new development. And to put this into perspective for people, all of your cell phones, all of your satellites are dependent on a very rare metal known as tantalum. Now, tantalum used to be a fictitious metal. It used to be a fictitious name that was applied to unattainable metals that had alchemical properties that did not exist in the natural state. Now, it was based on the Tantalus figure of Greek mythology, who is forever tantalized by water beneath him, which he can never reach. He's in a pool of water that he always tries to drink but can never reach. He has berries and food above him and branches that move away every time he reaches for them, so he can never grab them. He is forever tantalized in eternal torment in Greek mythology. So tantalum was this metal that represented that. And tantalum is very difficult to find on Earth. The major source of tantalum is from meteorites. So it is only, in general, where massive meteorite impact has occurred where tantalum can be, quote-unquote, harvested or mined. And tantalum has been found where in the bed of the ocean, where, of course, which was once surface, because any part that is now surface was once ocean. Any part that was once ocean is now surface. It's all part of geological tectonic plate motion. The Japanese have seriously been considered submarine mining to get that tantalum. That's how valuable it is, because all of your cell phones work on a tiny strip of tantalum. All of the satellites in our orbits have tiny strips of tantalum. This is what enables the telecommunications age. Because of tantalum, primarily being in the Congo, Blackwater, various other mercenary agencies have been representing different nations and corporate interests, Japanese, Russian, German, etc., and they have been fighting each other in the Congo for years for tantalum. The tantalum wars have resulted in 5 million dead. And you've never heard of it.
Wow, yeah.
And that is the kind of conflict that we're heading towards in the future. So this is the kind of world we live in. The majority of people are unaware of it. In terms of the Army, what is one of its reasons for an inability to function, and how does it function, that requires the use of these mercenaries? Well, one of the reasons why it doesn't function normally anymore is because of the cultic nature of this military force. There is a video that I have placed several times on my Facebook timelines always with the concern that it might be taken down by Facebook by request. If people request that something be taken off of Facebook, it has to be done.
Right.
If one doesn't want to suffer the consequences of ultimately being banned from Facebook. Now, the video that I put up, fortunately, no one has ever requested it be taken down because it's generally understood that my timeline is very much a mature timeline and that it's not for children. As a matter of fact, I've got a block on people who are under the age of 18, I believe, or 20 on my Facebook timeline that was set up by my graphic arts designer, my 3D graphics modeler. And in terms of the video I'm speaking of, it's called The Dark Side of Aldora. And in The Dark Side of Aldora, spelled A-L in the anglicization from the Arabic with a space and then D-O-U-R-A. The Dark Side of Aldora opens with, of course, the, Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney is stating, in order to do what we need to do, we have to go to the dark side. We have to go to the dark side.
Mm-hmm.
And then it shows U.S. Army Ranger John Needham. His last name, his family name is spelled Needham. And he's one of these Patrick Tillman types. With what I've described with the U.S. Army Rangers and some of the men who are in them, like John Stebbins, the child rapist in Leavenworth the rest of his life, I can go on describing many men like him in Special Forces. A good example of this would be Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez at the Presidio military base. Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez was sentenced to a drug rehabilitation program at the Letterman Army Medical Center. Now, 25%, fully a quarter of all U.S. Army doctors were trained at Letterman Army Medical Center on the Presidio military base. That building, of course, was totally deconstructed to hide all evidence of human experimentation that went on there. And to put this into perspective, because this is easily verifiable, it's easily vettable, what happened was our American population, third largest in the world, has the largest prison population on Earth in proportion to that population. In other words, in proportion to our baseline population, we have more people in prison than any other country on Earth, including North Korea or Communist China.
Right.
So what happens with the people in that prison? Well, there's an unholy alliance between the penitentiary system and the U.S. military. As a matter of fact, the highest paid law enforcement officers union in the world is the state of California's prison guards union. That's how big the penitentiary system is. And there's an unholy alliance between them and the U.S. Army where prisoners will get full gubernatorial pardon of death sentences. They'll get revocation of sentences. They'll get shortening of sentences or prison privileges if they volunteer for human Army experiments. So the U.S. military would bring in prisoners from all over California and experiment on them at the Letterman Army Medical Center. I was personally witness to this because of the fact, both documentationally and personally, because of the fact that as a DoD research librarian, I had to liaise not only with the Satanic Chaplain, one of my other responsibilities was to liaise with the Letterman Army Medical Center Medical Library. And also I had to provide these people with reading materials. So the MPs would bring in men who were undergoing experimentation, in the majority men, some women, and they would bring them up to the post library in chains and under armed guard, and I would help them select what reading materials they wanted, and they could take it back to their hospital cell and read. So this is the history of the Presidio military base, and oftentimes, often enough, some of those prisoners would disappear, and they would go off the records, and no one would know whatever happened to them.
Man.
And that's the kind of world we're dealing with. Now, do want to point out the fact, if you want to see what happened to one of those prisoners, I went to City College of San Francisco where I majored in criminology. My instructors in forensic photography, who were quite elderly and just getting ready to retire, were the same instructors who taught Magus Anton Szandor LaVey, the Black Pope of the First Church of Satan, everything he knew about forensic photography, because he became a forensic photographer for the San Francisco Police Department in order to evade the Korean War era draft. And everything they taught me, I utilized in terms of micro cameras. Back in those days, there were little German Zeissoptik disposable micro cameras. You would keep the film in refrigerators, and you'd see in the old spy films, you'd pull out the camera, which was smaller than a cigarette case, and you would photograph plans or documents or something. In this case, I was using it to photograph the human and animal victims of satanic sacrifice on site, the Presidio military base.
Wow.
And so if you order my DVD set from DouglasDietrich.com, you will see photos of human and animal ritual sacrifice, the victims thereof, their bodies, that you will find absolutely nowhere else.
Wow.
So that is important to emphasize.
Is that
And
the
so
Satan's Crusaders DVD?
that is quite correct. And we're selling two for the price of one, Roswell and the Rising Sun, which unfortunately producing that led directly to my mother's death. That's an entirely different story. She died under highly suspect circumstances, which would take forever to describe. She died directly as a result of my producing that DVD. I came home to find her dying. And it took her 2 months to die, very painfully, in excruciating agony, and that was the message they wanted to send. At any rate, those two DVDs are being sold for the price of one. Go to www.douglasdietrich.com. Douglas is spelled with one S. Dietrich is spelled just like the actress Marlene Dietrich, to whom I'm distantly related. If you're too young to remember her, just put the words diet and rich together, douglasdietrich.com. And just order them while we have a few left to order, because we don't have many left after the Asian Lunar New Year, where we set up the 2-for-1 price, and that will help immensely to support me. Obviously, with my background, it's extremely hard to find any conventional employment, and my career is, at this point, being a professional whistleblower.
Yeah, but you seem to be doing I just wanted to say, you seem to be doing a great job at that, obviously. I mean, you're presenting so much interesting information, and I have been lucky enough to see Roswell and the Rising Sun. It's a lot of great information. It's very sad that led to the death of your mother, and I would love to talk about that on another show, but this one we seem to be dealing more with the satanic elements and that stuff. And I haven't got to see your Satan's Crusaders DVD, but I did want to – I wrote this down. I copied this from the description because it was so interesting. But it says – magical practice and strategy provoked initiatives such as utilizing Tesla-derived Montauk technology to contain and control devils summoned in the wake of American genocide during World War II. Can you talk about the Tesla technology or the Montauk technology a little bit?
Sure, I'll go into that a bit. Keep in mind, I'm not trained as an engineer, so
of course,
way that I would describe that would be more from its sociological impact.
That's perfect.
Yeah, and to finalize what I was saying about the prisons and the military,
sure.
The general point that I was trying to come to with Ranger John Needham in the film The Dark Side of Aldura was that, which I did not produce, it's important to emphasize, that's just something that people can look up on YouTube and review for free. John Needham was like a Patrick Tillman character who basically, after 9/11, volunteered for the most patriotic and naive of reasons, and he winds up in what's essentially a criminal organization surrounded by a bunch of very hardened, violent personalities, that many of whom would, if not being in the military, would otherwise be in prison. There's no dodging that. There are many people in this day and age, just like during the Vietnam War era, who are given a choice between prison and military service.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, there was a recent documentary, comparatively recent, on BBC or PBS I was watching, where there was this one guy who was playing an Xbox video game, and he became so angry at his partner beating him in it that he pulled out a gun and blew his brains out. He did this when he was 17 years old. And what did they do? They let him serve in Iraq instead of going to prison.
Wow.
And by the way, he was the most well-adjusted in that documentary. He was the most well-adjusted compared to the rest of them. But at any rate, you can imagine somebody who turns down a multi-million-dollar NFL contract like Patrick Tillman. He winds up in the company of all these U.S. Army Rangers. And these guys are like thrill killers, a lot of them. And he's like saying, charge, we're going to take that hill. And they just shove him in the back. And as a matter of fact, his own coroner ultimately admitted all of his bullets were American-sourced bullets from an American gun fired point blank into his bag. And so he's fragged. He was basically fragged by his own troops. And this other ranger, Needham, in the film The Dark Side of Aldura, it's so important because he went stark raving mad because he was constantly witness to satanic sacrifices in the field, that he was totally unaware of why his fellow rangers were doing this and where it came from. So there's footage and photos he kept taking so that he could bring his fellow rangers to justice for war crimes. He kept turning into the high command, which kept basically shelving them, and finally they ordered his own troops to beat him half to death. And he was locked in a container box without air holes for weeks while they just basically semi-suffocated him, opened it every once in a while to let air in and throw him food, never cleaned up his defecation or his urine. He's wallowing in his own waste products, and finally drove him stark raving mad. In the heat, if you can imagine, the desert in the heat is enough where if you've got polished shoes, the polish will melt and run off your shoes. And he's in a container box in that kind of temperatures in the daytime. So he's burning his skin just by touching the metal around the container. So this is the conditions they kept him in, and finally released him to a hospital with burns, infections from his own fecal matter going into the burns. He came home, and his girlfriend was an Army nurse. She left him because he was, of course, stark raving mad. She had to pull a knife out of his hand while he's naked, cowering in the corner, waking up in the middle of the night. Finally, he meets another girlfriend, kills her. Then, because he's so obviously not in control of himself, the judge just sentenced him to an insane asylum and psychological treatment. And he was walking with his dad along a beach and just died like nothing, like bam, just like a being hit him. And his dad said there was no medical reason for his death. The autopsy showed nothing was wrong. It was just all very mysterious. And in terms of what he did see that was photographed, you will see satanic sacrifice in The Dark Side of Aldura. You see U.S. Army Rangers taking always men. They have to have men. They can't do it with women because the women have estrogen. They want to keep their testosterone levels up. But they take men and they blow their brains out or bash their brains in with rifle butts. And they take the brains out and they eat them.
Holy shit.
And the photos are right there in The Dark Side of Aldura. And that is a satanic sacrament. I knew exactly what it was when I saw it. And then in terms of him, of course, he didn't know what was going on. He had no narrative context in which to place his experience. And because he lacked a narrative context in which to place his experience, he became a victim of that experience. Because I know what I know, many people will logically ask, how is it you're not murdered? Why is it you're not killed?
Yeah, that was on my list of questions.
Oh, of course. And I've explained this on other programs, and I'm happy to explain it here. The reason why is, again, the thorough corruption and incompetence of the government. Now, in the case of, for instance, very famous men or men who have actual power behind them, they have massive security apparatus to protect them, but nevertheless, it should not be impossible to kill them. Now, M16, M15, throughout World War II, orchestrated no less than about several hundred, probably around 300 assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler throughout the 12 years he was in power during the time of the Third Reich's presence in Europe. And they all failed. And altogether, when you count in other assassination attempts from his own generals who were part of the resistance, other elements of insurgents, it made it about 500,000 assassination attempts in a 12-year period, and they all failed. Okay, that's well beyond any logical failure rate. That is because the U.S. Army drew the conclusion, and the U.S. military, as well as the British, drew the conclusion that he was a precognitive, that he was essentially a precog, that he actually knew when people were going to try to kill him. Now, that's a totally different subject that would take us into remote viewing, take us into other areas of psychic research. Has nothing to do with what I'm going to say, but what does have is, say, for instance, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is right across the bay. The largest CIA installation in the world outside of Langley, Virginia, is in Miami, where they have constantly used Cuban ex-migres and repatriates to try and infiltrate Cuba and take out Fidel Castro. Again, about half a thousand assassination attempts. They've all failed. Okay, this is not due to precognitive ability on part of Fidel Castro. This is due to American corruption and incompetence. Now, in terms of how extant that is, a great example would be the nuclear codes. The United States Strategic Air Command, SAC, starting in 1961, organized the Minuteman nuclear missile system. And because they had an 8-digit code to launch those missiles, the theory was that they were going to change those codes every day. And every day those 8 codes would be a series of 8 different numbers that everyone would have to memorize so that they could launch the missiles on command.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reality is they were too fat and happy and lazy to ever follow such a protocol. So the reality was that the nuclear launch code for years, throughout the Vietnam War, from the 1961 until at least the 1980s, was 8 zeros. So if you knew that, and you had some way to break in to a Minuteman missile system, you could have launched a nuclear missile knowing what I've just told you. That
Wow.
is how corrupt they were. So in terms of this, by the way, this is all vettable. It was revealed by Bruce Blair, who was a doctor and a Minuteman launch officer during this period. And the firing crew was just so lazy that for all of these Air Force personnel that they made that universal. And when this was brought out to McNamara, if you remember Defense Secretary Robert McNamara throughout the Vietnam War, he didn't learn about this. Think about what I'm saying. The Secretary of Defense did not know this. And he didn't know this until 2004. So between 1961 and 1977, well after America's retreat from Vietnam, you've got this coded situation that the Secretary of Defense doesn't even know about. And when McNamara was told about it, he pleaded total ignorance. And I believe him. I believe he did not know about it. I believe he was a total ignoramus. That's the same with what protects me. What I have is the occult equivalent of the nuclear codes. And that brings us back to the Montauk and the Tesla technology. The occult equivalent of the nuclear codes unleashes the entities which they've bound using the HARP technology. That's what it's used for, not what most people think. Its origins are completely different. Its original purpose was completely different, but what it has been utilized for in recent times has been the harnessing of the entities which they have summoned. Now, in terms of the rationalist or the materialist or the atheistic or the logic-oriented who say, well, that's crazy, that doesn't work, I don't believe in that, it doesn't make any sense, how can the occult really impact you? Well, I'll tell you this, it does not matter that you don't believe in demons or the occult. It does not matter one whit that you don't believe in magic. All that matters is that all the men you give your money to, that 1% that gets over half of the fiscal discretionary income every year, what matters is that they believe in the occult. They believe in demons. They believe in magic. This is the paradigm on which they operate. So whether you believe it or not, they are convinced that the occult equivalent of the nuclear codes, which I hold, are operable. And they can't change them.
Right.
Because the entities that are bound respond to basically inviolable equations.
Can you describe these entities at all? Because this is something that has come up a couple of times in the show before, at least in terms of what you say about it doesn't matter if you believe it, it's what they believe. And I wonder if it's just a superstition, like even though, you know, they're the powerful people who believe it, is there something to it or is it a superstition? Like, can you describe these entities that they've conjured up at all?
To an extent, yes. To a large extent, they are literally indescribable. They are, a good name for them would be anti-gods. That would be a good handle on what we're speaking about. But to put it into perspective for you about HARP and how it binds them, this is the important thing to keep into perspective. The HARP acronym, which you see, which is HAARP, is not the real acronym. Okay, that is simply a popular acronym that was coined for press releases. The actual acronym is HA cubed R squared P squared. And what that stands for, the numbers are not pronounced when you voice or vocalize the acronym, but what that stands for is High Frequency Activated Auroral Atmospheric Resonance Research Projection Program. And the reason it was created was because of the Japanese in World War II with their balloon bomb campaign against the United States, which I'm not going to go into in any great depth because it would take hours to explain the success of that program. But the point is that the prevailing winds blow from Japan towards North America via the jet stream. Emperor Hirohito of the Japanese was a marine biologist. And as a marine biologist, he understood the Kuroshio, the Japan current, that carried the current all the way from Japan to the United States. That's one of the things that brings all the radiation from Fukushima Daiichi to the United States this day. Following that marine current is, of course, the jet stream, the atmospheric current, which in World War II, Emperor Hirohito, as a marine biologist, knew all about, but the United States, believe it or not, did not know about. They didn't have a single scientist in the United States who even knew the existence of the jet stream. So when the Americans started trying to bomb Japan, they would go up to basically 30 miles in the air. They'd go to basically hundreds of feet in the air. When they reached 20,000 feet, then basically they're getting winds that are 30 to 60 miles per hour. When they get to higher than that, they're suddenly getting 300 miles an hour. Okay, because of this, all of the B-29 bombers had to hit the ground, as they used in the airman's vernacular, and fly in very low. And because of that, Japanese anti-aircraft fire would take them all out. And as a result, the Americans lost no less than 5,000 bombardier crewmen who were bombing Japan. Of those, less than 80 of them survived, who were lucky enough to be caught by the Japanese police or military for interrogation. The rest were torn apart alive by Japanese on the ground, understandably, for bombing their cities. And so when the Americans had, by the way, it was statistically far more dangerous and deadly to be an airman in World War II than it was to be a Marine. You had such staggering proportion of losses that if you survived 50 missions, they made you a general. Automatically, just made you a general if you survived 50 missions, because the chances of your surviving were just so low. So most people never even conducted 50 missions throughout the war. So that puts that in some perspective. So what did the Americans do? They said, look, you've got this jet stream that the Japanese are able to send thousands of incendiary fire balloons over using the jet stream, made of silk and rubber, etc., very cheap materials, costs them pennies on the dollar. We do not have enough manpower to put out the fires. We don't have enough men to fly planes at home to shoot them down. We don't have any rockets we can build to take them out. It would cost hundreds of dollars to build a rocket to take out something that's costing the Japanese like $20 to build. So basically what the Americans were left with was a situation that was totally untenable, and the Americans said, we need to build a machine to change the jet stream. So one of the weapons was scalar weaponry and resonance weaponry, and they consulted with Nikola Tesla. And Nikola Tesla, of course, was already appalled by the designs they had for experimentation with temporal displacement or taking a vessel out of our space-time continuum so that no bullets or missiles could hit it. This is what was part of the Montauk experimentation. Now, all of this was launched with Tesla under contract, and then he killed himself. And that's something most Americans don't know, was basically Tesla had been abused all of his life, as most people are aware of, by men like Thomas Edison, by men like J.P. Morgan, by so many of the people who were supposed to be his benefactors, that he had grown completely disillusioned. And when the American government basically came up to Nikola Tesla and said, we want all of this for weaponry, he figured the Americans were going to conquer the world, that they were just going to basically set up their own world-spanning empire. He gave all of the documents that he could to his son-in-law, who was a Yugoslav diplomat. So his son-in-law took everything he could carry in several autoloads home, back to Yugoslavia, at that time was in the midst of a vicious civil war within the Second World War. Croatia was an active Axis satellite, and that's how Nazi Germany and the Third Reich got hold of Tesla technology. Serbia was invaded by the communists under Josip Broz Tito, and that is how the Soviet Union gained access to Nikola Tesla technology. And the Third Reich shared it with their ally Japan, which is how Japan got a hold of scalar weapons and Tesla technology. So because of this, there were three rival empires that ultimately prevented a Pax Americana, or a global world order under the United States, at the conclusion of proactive hostilities in 1945. So he was considered a traitor. The Americans called him up immediately and said, your citizenship is revoked. And they told him exactly what they told every Japanese individual. Keep in mind, all of our civil statutes, which prevent our rights from being violated, were still in effect when all of the Japanese were stuck in internment camps, along with many Germans and many Italians, which most Americans don't know about. 124,000 U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry were stuck in camps, many of them used for slave labor. Many of them died. All of them had all of their real estate property, their fiscal property, all of their personal and material property stolen by the U.S. government through the OAP, the Office of Alien Property, because they were all declared illegal enemy aliens. They were all had their citizenship revoked, and it was this Office of Alien Property which stole all of Tesla's property that was left in the United States, not the FBI. So when the U.S. government called Tesla to say, now you're a foreign citizen, just like any Japanese person, we're going to detain you in an internment camp, and we're going to torture you until you cooperate with us, he killed himself. And the Office of Alien Property came in, took everything he had, put it under national security to this day. And they hated him so much that the U.S. government launched a propaganda campaign, and this is the connection between the military and Hollywood, through the Office of War Information, the OWI. They launched a campaign against him in his death, posthumously, where Tesla was the first villain in the Superman cartoons. It was not Lex Luthor. If you ever look up the early
Really?
Superman cartoons, yes. If you ever look up the early Superman cartoons, as a matter of fact, David Hatcher Childress basically anthologized all of the Superman versus Tesla cartoons on DVD. So you can actually look that up on the internet and purchase that, Superman versus Tesla.
Yeah.
But in theaters all over the United States, they would show Tesla as the ultimate enemy of the United States. And not only that, they brought Bela Lugosi out of retirement, the man who had played the original Dracula. And Bela Lugosi was brought out of retirement for his first big studio production in years, because he had been languishing due to a morphine habit. They brought him out to play Tesla the Vampire, and that you can find, again, on DVD. You can look that up on the internet and purchase your own copy, Return of the Vampire. And in the film Return of the Vampire, Bela Lugosi plays Tesla as a vampire.
Wow.
And so that is how much the U.S. government propagandized against Nikola Tesla.
Destroy the reputation.
Yes. Destroyed his reputation in death.
Yeah.
Destroyed his reputation in death. They were left with this technology, which they didn't know how to apply, which led to the Montauk disaster of the USS Eldridge. Totally different story. It would take hours to go into. But the end product of it was they were utilizing variations of this technology to create the HARP. Now, the HARP was originally meant to change the course of the jet stream. That is what it was for. They could reverse the course of the jet stream. Now, the Japanese are well familiar with this threat to them, and this is why you can go online and you can monitor HARP activity to this day by going to the website that's provided by the University of Tokyo. So if you want to see HARP's activation processes, you go to the website sponsored by the University of Tokyo, and you can see whether HARP is active or not. Now, HARP is almost never active. HARP went through a period of massive testing, some aggressive deployment, and impacting the atmosphere, reversing the jet stream. But since that period of time, via the monitoring station of the University of Tokyo, you can prove to yourself it's very passive, It's not active. And the reason for this is because now it is essentially used as a binding mechanism. Now, what am I talking about? Basically, what happened was the U.S. government was in an occult race with the British Empire for who could be the dominant occult power. Many centuries ago, there was the John Dee, the last officially recognized royal sorcerer of the British dynasty. And John Dee was the original 007. That was his code name that was applied in occult terms. And John Dee, by the way, people can look this up and verify this. This is all vettable. This is basically not even occulted history per se. John Dee developed Britain's monumental intelligence network, one of the most professional and ruthless in the world. And John Dee was a sorcerer who was credited with raising the storm which scattered the Spanish Armada. So he was essentially the pioneer of occult warfare on the military front. Now, he had later successors that increasingly took Britain towards a more and more diabolical bent. John Dee was no diabologist, nor was he a demonologist. He did neither study nor worship demons. But many occult British practitioners of the noble class in Britain did, and they ultimately established what became known as the Hellfire Club. Now, the Hellfire Club is a historical reality. Most Americans know of it only through the historically based villain team known as the Hellfire Club in the X-Men. There was a genuine Hellfire Club for hundreds of years, and it's degenerated now into kind of like a bondage enthusiasts kind of nightclub scene for the decadent elite in Britain. But for a great deal of the Victorian era, it ran the British Empire, because the British elite were picking up not only occult secrets from the heritage of John Dee, but from their invasion and occupation of India and the British Raj. They picked up Kundalini, various other forms of Oriental techniques, as they refer to them as, of mysticism, perfected these techniques as well as they could to enhance their occult powers, and they began to sacrifice to these dark gods that they were trying to summon to help them maintain secular power over the world. They controlled 24%, fully a quarter of the world's landmass. They controlled fully a quarter of the world's population through the British Raj and other conquests. Keep in mind, there's 1 billion people in India. So when India alone on the subcontinent added well over 1 billion people when you include Afghanistan, Burma, the conquest in Africa, the British Empire was more than enormous. Again, it controlled 25% of the world's population, 25% of their landmass, the majority of the sea lanes. How did they get this far so fast? Basically, through occult means. That's what their noble class believed. How were they making sacrifice unto these dark gods? They were doing it mainly in India. Everybody's heard of the Great Wall of China.
Right.
Almost no one's heard of the Great Hedge of India. In India, they took the British hedgerow. Now, a hedgerow is an incredibly hard obstacle to go through. When the Americans invaded France in World War II, they ran into what they called hedgerow hell, the bocage. And it was in the bocage of France that the Germans had hollowed out these thorny bramble bushes and put mortar nests in them, machine gun nests in them. In the end, the only way the Americans could respond was to put forklifts on Sherman tanks and bulldoze through the hedgerows that were decimating their troops. Now, imagine those hedgerows from Europe taken down to India. They mutate in the tropical environment. They grow to monstrous proportions. And the British created what was known as the Great Hedge of India. They divided it into 4 quarters between north and south and east and west, across. They put the entire subcontinent of India under the crucifix of a crown of thorns. And with this cross of thorns, they were able to divide all the populations of India from each other. You couldn't get food without going through the checkpoints of the bramble bush. So it was this checkpoints that the British used to starve entire populations of India who were in rebellion. They were able to cut off medicine. They were able to cut off anything they wanted. So in the end, they killed millions and millions of people. Remember, India has a population of 1 billion. And they were able to do this continuously by chokehold points using the Great Hedge of India. People can look this
Wow.
up. The Great Hedge of India is something people can look up. When the British left, no one was there to maintain the hedge, and gradually the Indian people were able to dismantle it and mow it to the ground, and there's no sign left today of the Great Hedge of India that had crucified so painfully the entire subcontinent for so long. And if you ever take a look at the original Captain Nemo book written by Jules Verne, Jules Verne, of course, was French. The French were at war with the British for hundreds of years. He hated the British. His hero of that book, the original 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, was an Asian Indian named Captain Nemo. Now, when the British translated that book to English, they obliterated, they censored at least 25%, if not half the book. So when the Americans read it, after it was first translated by the English, the Americans had no idea Captain Nemo was ethnically based, that he was an Asian Indian. It wasn't until that cinematic atrocity, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, was the first film to ever portray Captain Nemo for what Jules Verne had intended him to be, an Asian Indian.
Interesting.
So, I mean, and so he was portraying him as someone who hated the British Empire for murdering all his family. That's where all that comes from. And the whole point about this, by the way, he had a real-life equivalent, Sirhan Chandra Bose, and that would be another program we could go into.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but at any rate, the whole point of this that I'm bringing up about India was this is what kept their demons fed. Now, Colonel Michael Aquino told me, he said, just as the Roman Empire had stolen all of the gods of the Greeks, all of the Hellenic Greek classical culture was hijacked by the Romans who had no culture of their own. All the Romans had to offer was a proto-Stalinist garrison state, a military machine of Spartan-like soldiers that were regimenting every society they conquered. And so they, having no culture or even religion of their own, they took the Greek religion, hijacked it, and Romanized and militarized their gods. Venus became, Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars, and Zeus became Jove or Jupiter. You know, all of these gods were changed into a Latin context. Now, he explained to me that just as the Roman Empire hijacked the Hellenic culture and empire and ultimately infected it and conquered the known world using their own perversion of that culture, the Americans had done so with Britain's demons. All of Britain's demons were hijacked and went over to the American side, and America inherited, devoured, ingested, digested the British Empire.
That's interesting. It's tough to really like quantify what that means, you know. Like
I'll try my best.
We do only have a few minutes left, but I do want to let you get to your point on this, and then I have one other question. Yeah. But yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So during the First World War and the Second World War, the Americans conducted a series of mass sacrifices that fed the demons better than the British ever could. In World War I, the Americans created, and we could go over the technical process of this on another program, the Americans incepted the H1N1 avian swine flu again, in Kansas. And they did this from, remember what I told you about the military prison connection. They drafted prisoners out of San Quentin, and these conscripts were sent in unrefrigerated boxcars that were loaded with cages full of live chickens. And the particulate matter of the chicken fecal droppings, their shedded feathers, as the train was constantly moving, was inhaled and ingested every time these men opened their mouths. By the time that they got to the Kansas region, they all had what was known as chicken roll. Out of this was incepted the avian flu, hemagglutinin 1, neuromodes 1, and the Americans sent them over to Spain to disembark, hence the name Spanish flu. All this was intentional. The Americans knew exactly what they were doing. It was a design that was incepted by William Henry Welch, the single most powerful individual in the history of American medicine and one of the most knowledgeable. Welch and John D. Rockefeller together created the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, arguably the best scientific research institute in the world of its time. And they got together with Army Surgeon General General William Gorgas, Gorgas, who made sure all the men slept together, and they took the index patient, Albert Gitchell, who had suffered and survived and became a carrier. They made him the cook for 56,000 new recruits.
Wow.
And by the time they sent the Americans over, the avian flu was so virulent that it killed more people in Europe in 24 hours than AIDS killed in 24 years. It killed more people in a single year than the Black Plague killed in 100 years.
Wow.
It killed 100 million people worldwide, and you've never heard of it. Then, during World War II, the Americans were in a race with the desperate British to who could kill the most using unrestricted bombing. And they were firebombing people in every civilian population center that they could. They were so adamant on beating each other on how many people they could kill with bombing that when the Germans said, we've got to protect Dresden, Dresden is a cultural treasure, it's loaded with Gothic cathedrals and porcelain dolls, what do we do to protect the population and the cultural heritage and national treasure of Dresden? They took all of the American prisoners of war, British prisoners of war, Polish, Russian. They put thousands and thousands of prisoners of war. Literally, there was a population of prisoners in Dresden that had no room to house them, but they were putting them there as human shields against Allied bombing. And one of the survivors was Kurt Vonnegut Jr., who wrote the book and the movie Slaughterhouse-Five, because there was no place to put all these prisoners other than in slaughterhouses. Now, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. was Jewish, but the Germans considered him American as opposed to Jewish, so he didn't wind up in a concentration camp. He was a military prisoner of war. He was in one of these slaughterhouses, and that's when he realized how evil the Americans and the British truly were. Those prisoners were just a beacon. The Americans and the British said, great, that's more people to kill. They bombed Dresden, and they killed hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners. And they had no care for it. Another great example of how the Americans operated was after Operation Halyard. All kinds of Americans were shot down in the attempt to bomb the Ploesti oil fields in Romania. And the Serbs rescued over half a thousand of them. Altogether, the Serbs rescued 600 Allied airmen. About 521 were U.S. citizens. They delivered them to Pickup Point. This was the largest missing in action or MIA rescue operation in history. And what the Americans did after they got all of their bombardiers back was they turned around and they bombed the Serbs. They waited until high noon on Serbian Orthodox Easter, April 27th, 1944, right after church feast, to make sure they killed as many people as possible in the churches, and they killed 10,000 civilian Serbs in Belgrade alone.
Wow.
So the Americans not only killed 62,000 Italians, 900,000 Japanese, and, of course, 600,000 Germans, they killed 24,000 Serbs, their own allies, using strategic bombing. This is how crazed your Strategic Bombing High Command was. Well, how was the Strategic Bombing Command formed? It was formed out of men who flew in the Millionaires Unit in World War I. In World War I, killing was the sport of kings. All these men got together who were part of Princeton University and Yale, and they formed what was called the Millionaires Club, and the only way you could join this organization was if you were a member of Skull and Bones. And people can look this up and vet what I'm saying. These guys were so rich, they bought their own fighter planes and air crews in World War I to fight the Germans just as a hunting sport. And these men loved the thrill of being able to hunt men in the air and the thrill of getting shot back at, the thrill of suffering, perhaps dying. And these were the men who founded the Strategic Air Command. They were all Skull and Bones men. They were all following the occult rituals of mass sacrifice. In the end, they were convinced to rip a hole in the fabric of space and time itself and call in the outer gods, the anti-gods, which H.P. Lovecraft had been warning about. And
Wow.
in the end, the entities that they called forth, these qlipothic entities that came from dead universes, failed cosms of creation, they have them harnessed now using the HARP technology. And this harnessing technique, Colonel Aquino said, is very much like having a very large man being stuck to a buffet table with a thumb cuff. So long as he's fed, he's not going to complain. But if he is not fed, he can break loose from that thumb cuff and cause an immense amount of damage to the room in which the buffet table is laid out.
Wow.
This is why they have to constantly keep the wars going, the killing going. They can't stop.
Got to feed
They've
the beast.
Yes.
Wow. That is intense, man. Dude, I have had an amazing time just listening to you for way longer than a typical show that we do here. My brain is thoroughly melted down to its core. Let me have you can if you have any more to add to that story, feel free. But we got like 2 minutes left, so.
I just want to thank both of you. I think Kyle and of course Mr. Carl Wood are wonderful hosts, and I look forward to doing interviews again with them in the very near future.
Absolutely.
I want to thank them for their patience and their indulgence, and I want to say to our listenership, if you want to learn more about what I've said about the Third Reich in exile, also go to www.nexusmagazine.com. I was featured in Nexus Magazine with a series of interview installments. That it's a bi-monthly periodical, so I was a full feature of their magazine for literally half a year. And these 3 installments can be downloaded for $1.50 each. I do not make a penny off of that. This is simply for your information, and they need to charge you that to maintain the service. And the reason it's so important to go to Nexus Magazine, NEXUS, is because they're banned in the United States. Nexus Magazine, which is an English magazine, it does circulate in German language on the continent of Europe, but it is published out of Australia and circulates throughout the British Commonwealth of Nations. It is extremely popular the world over, and yet it's banned in the United States. You will never find a copy of Nexus Magazine on display on American magazine shelves. It's outlawed here. So that's important to access it via the internet, get information on the Third Reich in exile that Douglas Dietrich, conducted with his interviewer Thomas Kirschner originally in the Deutsch language, but it's all in English. And other than that, go to www.douglasdietrich.com to help support me